We have endgames, starting with beginning of the game, which covers basic stuff, basic endings. Okay, let me set up something. Uh, trash. King here, on here, and a king here. Perfect. So, ending number one, the rule of the square. So the question is, can this pawn promote by itself? And there's the rule of the square, so it's basically if the basically you form a square like this from the pawn to the uh, end of the board where it would potentially queen. And if the king can get inside that square, basically touch the square at all, then the king can catch the pawn before it queens or promotes. It's not always a queen, but like 99% of the time it's you promote to a queen. However, this is a little misleading because technically the king is in the square, but this is not uh this is not taking for the fact that this pawn is on the second rank and it can't and it can what am I thinking of? It can go two squares on its first move. So if we move the pawn here, all of a sudden here's the square. And so if the king moves, it's still not in the square. So the pawn will promote, and I'll just play it out like that. The king is one spot too late. So yes, in this position, the white pawn can promote because the king is not in the square. Now, if the king were here, then if we make a square, no, make a square like this. Because since I'm accounting for the fact that the pawn can move two squares on this first move, the king is already in the square. So the king can catch the pawn this time. What happens? So if I go here, the king arrives just in time to stop the pawn. Okay, here, next concept. I'm really just doing this as I go. How do I get back to the editor? Setup position. Now, instead of just a game of can the king catch the pawn, we need to try to block the king from promoting. So if if the pawn alone running is not an option, what you need to do is escort it with your own king. When possible, and this is a direct quote from the book, when possible, the stronger side's king will prevent its rival from standing in front of the pawn. If he succeeds, the pawn promotes. So in this game, the correct move is king to c7 here because it blocks these three squares. It forms a wall. So the black king has to go here, but then the black king can't get to the pawn in time because by the time the black king gets here, the pawn gets here, which is in the territory of our own king here. And so the pawn will easily promote, and there's nothing that black can do. kind of wish there's like another example of this in the book. I guess I could make one. Like, well, what if it was on A7? I think it's just the same thing. Well, actually, no. Let's put him on A6. Because in this case, pawn, uh, it's, huh? Hold on. Yeah, it's white to move. White to move. Load it up. Okay. If black goes here, then the move is to play king a7 to, again, block this queenie square off from the black king. If it goes here, pawn goes here. And the pawn and the king collectively block these 4 squares off from the black king. So no matter where he goes, the pawn will just promote again. And then, now here's the concept of, well, no, it's still a concept on opposition, but what if the pawn is already on the 6th rank? So the example has a pawn here, king here, and white king here. So before, we have seen 2 simple cases where the king does not support the pawn. We have the white king all the way here, the black king was here, and the pawn was here. Because in the case where we don't need to support a pawn because it just runs, then the other case was when we were able to put our king in between our pawn and our opponent's king to give it safe passage to the end of the board. But in this example, the next example in this book, what if the pawn's already on the 6th rank and it's like this? The key here is to defend key square in front of the pawn. And after that, everything depends on the relative position of the kings from each other. If I load this up, see, according to this, to the computer, the only move that wins for white is to move this pawn to f7. And so now the only legal move is for the king to move to e7, because king guards these squares, then pawn attacks these squares. The king has to move here, then the king just moves here, and he's guarding the square in front of the pawn. However, if you take the same scenario, and all of a sudden it's black to move, it's a draw. So the black has to just take opposition from the white king, like this, and if we do the same move, pawn to f7, this is a check, the king just has to move in front of the pawn, and we cannot move to g7 to support this square, because the king attacks this square. The only way we don't lose the pawn is we move the king here, but this is a stalemate. Because the black king is not under attack, and we control all these squares. It's a stalemate, it's a draw. There's a typical rule of thumb that I've learned, is that in a situation like this where you have the kings kind of facing off, and the pawn is on the 6th rank, if the pawn goes onto the 7th rank with check, then it's a draw. Because, again, even if the black king goes here, if we go... Well, actually, this is losing, because the king can just go to g7. But in theory, the pawn goes here. If we check, then the king just goes here, and we have the same exact scenario. The only way we don't lose the pawn on the next move is if we go here, but this is a stalemate. If we don't do that, if we do anything else, he just takes the pawn, and it's a draw to insignificant material. So if we go back like this, set the board up. Again, if the pawn is able to reach the 7th rank without a check, then the pawn promotes. But if it's with check, then it's a stalemate. Or not a stalemate, but a draw. It could be a draw by stalemate, or it could be a draw to insufficient material. Okay, my book says, let me set the board up. It has to be black. If the kings are facing each other on the same file when the pawn reaches the 7th rank, then it's a draw. Because again, there's still a check, so my little rule of thumb still applies. It says the reason the pawn cannot promote is that the pawn cannot promote if both kings are opposed when the pawn reaches the 7th rank. I mean, and if the king goes here, then that is then you need to oppose the king because we can just go here. But again, if I do this, then same thing. Just oppose the pawn and it's a draw. There's a bolded passage down here in the book that says, the safest way for the defender is to stay on the 2 squares available in front of the pawn. This fortress cannot be broken. It also says, the stronger side must not push the pawn too quickly. The pawn should only reach the 6th rank in one of 2 scenarios. Its path to promotion is clear, or its advance causes the kings to be opposed, but usually it only happens when the king has reached the 6th rank before the pawn. Let's look at another position. We have king here, and a pawn here on c6. White to move. So we need to support this pawn, right? Because if the pawn just moves to c7, then the king just moves here. And the king is cutting our king off from these squares to protect our pawn. If our pawn just promotes like that, he just takes. Draw to insufficient material. So we cannot push the pawn too quickly. However, so we must move our king up. But to what square? Well, what we need to happen is we need to have it so the kings are lined up on our opponent's turn. And that's what's generally known as opposition. So the correct way is to move our king to a6 here. And from here, the only move for black is king to b8, and after this we move king to b6, causing this opposition once again. Now, if the king moves to c8, it's basically a mirror of the previous scenario. We move the pawn to c7, moving the pawn to the 7th rank without check. The king has to move here, and our king goes here, the pawn promotes. Like that. However, you have to be careful. If the king goes into the corner here, then do not push your pawn to c7, because this is stalemate. Because our king attacks these 2 squares, and the pawn attacks this square, but the king is not in check. It's a stalemate. Therefore, instead, you could do this a couple different ways, but the best way is move the king to c7, and just give the pawn room to promote by moving your king to the other file on the other side of the pawn. Because now, even if the king moves, say, here, you can move the pawn up to the 7th rank with check, but that's only because our king already attacks the square in front of it. See, that's a kind of a, you could say, an exception to the rule. If your king is on the 6th rank and the pawn goes to the 7th rank with check, then the game is drawn. But if the king is on 7th rank supporting the pawn and the pawn goes to the 7th with check, it doesn't matter. So the king has to go somewhere else. To say it goes here, but then you promote to a queen, and you'll just end the game. So let's go all the way back here. What happens if we move our king to b6 initially instead of a6? Well, now that king can go here, and now we have this opposition of the kings, but now it's our move. So now if we move the pawn to 7th rank, we have the same pawn goes to the king on the 6th rank, pawn on the 7th rank with check. It's the same stalemate or draw to insufficient material kind of scenario. So even if we do something else, like king to a6, then the king can go to c7. We have to defend. Then he can go to c8. That's the only move that saves the draw. But then we can go to b6, but then he comes back to b8. And again, we have this opposition. We cannot advance the pawn. You can go here, but then he goes here. If we go here, then he goes back to c8. If we try something like this, he just comes here and we have to come back. It's a drawn game. It's gonna be a draw either by threefold repetition or stalemate or 50 moves without advancing a pawn or taking a piece. There's just no way for the white pawn to promote. And so this is an example of what's called losing the opposition. Now let me set up another example. What? Now we have the opposition. We have, well, yes, we have the opposition because this is kind of a more niche rule. But again, we have this opposition where the kings cannot come in contact with each other, but the pawn here also attacks this square, so the king cannot move here. So say if we go here, then the king can, well, the best move would be just go here and take the pawn, and the black king goes here, this is opposition. He could just match us. However, if we go here, the king cannot go here because the pawn attacks that square. So now he loses the opposition. And here, the best move, he could go king g8. However, we need to have the opposition, because if we go instantly king to f6, then the king goes here, we have opposition, and in the same scenario before, if the king is on the 6th rank, if the pawn goes to 7th with check, it's going to be a draw. So now we need to maintain the opposition by going to g8 instead. If the king goes to h8, then we can just go, well, we can just king here, solidifying the pawn's advance is fine. It still wins, but the pawn can also just run. Like the king can't catch it, and as a matter of fact, that's checkmate. So if the king goes here, we need to match it with the opposition yet again. Go here. Now, if the king goes here, it's the same example as before. Get in the front of the pawn, say he goes here, give the pawn room, and a safe passage. Or if he goes here, again, we can just move the pawn to the 7th rank without check, and he has to go here, and the pawn will promote. However, these rules are only valid for central pawns, and mostly bishop pawns for the most part. And what about a knight pawn, a pawn on either the B file or the G file as this is what's coming up in the book. So here's the situation where how can I throw away individual pieces? Hold on. The board, reset board, clear board. Well, this one has a black pawn anyway. So we have a black pawn here, the white king here, and the black king here. White to move. Nice pawn. So if it's a knight's pawn, well, the king's in check. Well, it has to move anyway, but it has two options: G1 or H1. So for one thing, we know is that opposition is not an option because the white king is on the wrong side of the pawn. So if we know if he moves in front of the pawn, then it's just the same concept except reverse for black. So the black can just move the pawn to the second rank without check, and the king has to move here. Black king goes here, white king go here, and the pawn promotes. But let's look at the other option. If this was a central pawn, then his position would have been an easy win for black. However, the king moves to h1 instead, and the position is drawn. Because if the king moves up to support this square, then this is a stalemate. Because again, pawn attacks this square, the king attacks these two squares. And if the pawn reaches the 7th rank with a check, is the same thing. King can go here and either lose the pawn, draw to insufficient material, or stalemate. So after king h1, king f2 is a stalemate, and pawn here leaves the king here and here, which is a stalemate. But what if the king moves to g4, then the white king can go here to g2. And it's this same thing that I explained earlier, that the kings can just do this shuffle forever, and the pawn's not going to get anywhere without a stalemate. Again, if the black king goes here, the white king can go here, and if black king goes here, opposition, and the black pawn would advance with a check, which will lead to a stalemate. If black king goes back, then either of these work. He has to go here, but then the white king can just go back to g1. Go here, he goes here, same opposition. And it's just going to be another draw. So now in the next thing, we're going to cover key squares for when the pawn has not yet reached the 6th rank. We're going to switch back to white. White pawn here, here, and here. If, hold on, let me read this a bit. I know exactly what this is, but I just need to read this. Okay. So key squares are for the most part relevant when the pawn has not yet reached the 6th rank. So here it's on the 5th rank. And on the 5th rank, the key squares are the 3 squares in front of it. So if the pawn here is on f5, then the key squares are e6, f6, and g6. If our, in this position, if our king is on any of these squares, we win. So here, the correct move is to use opposition with white to move with king f6. And then there's just this classic little shuffle and dance. It doesn't matter where the king goes. If he goes here, we go here, and the king attacks these 3 squares and gives safe passage for the pawn. If the black king goes on the other side, we match it, and it's the same thing, but mirrored. It might be a little confusing, since someone might think it's counterproductive to put your king in front of your pawn, but it's just how it's done, really. But that's for a center pawn, for the most part. What about a knight's pawn? It Because in comparison to a center pawn, a knight's pawn poses something else. So if we have a position like this, we just need to be a little, it's more or less the same thing. We just need to be a little careful. Again, the correct move is to move the king in front of the pawn. The black king has to move here. Wait a minute. Well, this is actually not the same concept since we have opposition on our move. So after this, the book goes with king to h6. And if black maintains the opposition, then we are able to push the pawn. Then the black king has to move here. And we can push the pawn again because we're entering the 7th rank without check. Has to go here. The white king goes up, pawn promotes. Oh no, the book doesn't go into it further, but what if we go here and goes... Well, that's the same thing, because pawn goes here. The king and the pawn attack all these squares, so king has to go here, and it's the same thing. And I could have sworn... Well, that's for a knight's pawn. What about a center pawn? What if it's like this, and it's white to move? Well, I guess it's the same thing. I could have sworn that there was a rule of thumb that in this position, if it's black's move, white wins, but if it's white's move, black can draw it. Goes here. That's just not good because the king goes here. Again, match it. Goes here. And it's just that same thing. So what am I thinking about? I don't... There was something. Hmm. Well, I don't know what I'm thinking about. Anyway, these are the anyway, these are the key squares when it comes to the pawn on the fifth rank, which are the squares, three squares directly in front of the pawn. But what if the pawn is not on the fifth rank? Say the next example gives the pawn here, the white king's here, and the black king is here. So now the key squares are the three squares two ranks ahead instead of just one rank. So if the white king is able to get to one of these squares, then white wins. So in this case, if white to move, the king can go here, the black king goes here, the white king can go here, and white just wins. If the black king goes here, actually, let me load it up. Here, here, white king goes here. If the black king goes here, you can just push. If it goes here, white can go here, and no matter where the black king goes, the pawn can just march. Or the black king just moved. White king goes here again. The black king goes here. D5 is good, and king D6 is good. Let's look at king D6 first. So king D6, making this opposition, and say if he goes to C8, we can go to D5, and he goes back. It's the same scenario. We go here, and if he goes here, push the pawn, and if he goes here, pawn reaches the 7th rank without check, and the king has to go here, and go here, and the pawn queens. So here, king e7 also works because the king goes here, pawn goes here, king blocks off these three squares, or the king blocks off these squares, the pawn blocks off this square. The king, say, goes here, and the pawn gets into the reach of our king, and it just happily promotes. So let's go back to this whole thing. What if it's black to move? Black gets to move first, then white goes here, and then black gets to go here. Take opposition. And now the white king was not able to get to any of these three squares, so the position is a draw. So let's say if we go here, he just takes opposition, and if we push the pawn, then the black king can go back. And if we push the pawn again, he can go back to d8. And so if we push our king to the 6th rank, the black king moves, gives opposition, and now again, if we move the pawn, it's with check, which leads to stalemate. If we go back, he just goes back. And it, again, is the same shuffle that will lead to a draw. And there's a thing called distant opposition. Let me load up something else. The book gives this scenario. I'm assuming it's black. No, it's white to move. Okay. There's a thing called distant opposition. So, again, let's take the key squares. The pawn has not reached the 5th rank, both black's 5th rank. It has not reached this rank. this rank. So the key squares are here, here, and here. So as white, how do we defend this? If we go here, black king can go here. And well, if the black king goes there and we go here, then it's a draw. Because the black king cannot get to these squares. However, this is bad because the correct move here for black is actually to take opposition with king b4. Now, if we move here, you move king c4. No matter where we move, like this, he goes to d3, and it's the same thing. However, the correct move here is actually king to b1 instead of b2. There's... Hold on, I'm reading. If the strong king reaches the 5th rank, and then his counterpart takes the opposition from the 2nd rank, is good, the former will not make progress or occupy the key squares. However, if we move to the 2nd rank, black takes the opposition because they are not yet on the 5th rank. Right, so if we go to here, then black king gets the opposition when they move up. So we move here, and if they move up, then we give them the opposition. And it's the position's a draw. What if they move here, same thing. We give them the draw. Well, we don't give it. I guess we make the game a draw by taking this opposition. And it's going to be the same shuffle that I've showed you like 2 or 3 times already. So the exact example in the book goes like this: king to b1, king to b4, king to b2, taking opposition. Then it goes c4, king c2, c3, king c1, king b3, king b1, c2, stalemate. So the whole distant opposition thing, it's more so timing it right. In the sense that you want to take opposition at the opportune time when the moment is best. And so, so if you move in too early, then that allows your opponent to take opposition instead of you, which will cost you the game. So let's set up another position. Black king here. White king here. We're using a white pawn instead. Like this. White to move. So now the book is talking about a reserve move. So in this position, the computer gives white the win. However, it's not easy because we need to outflank the enemy king to clear a path for our pawn. So let's see what happens if we move king to f5 and they maintain opposition. If we move back, then they just move back. So if we move here, they move here. If we move the pawn, and then they move, and we move back, take the opposition yet again, say they go here, And now we can outflank and actually move the king up. Now if they go here, let's see. King h7 is good. G5 is good. King g6 is good. Pretty much everything is good. So let's go through them one at a time. We can move the king here. They go here. Then we have this wall, and the pawn will just promote. If we move the king here, and they move their king here, they have opposition, but we can use the reserve move that the book is talking about by moving our pawn here. So now they have to move, and we can move here, outflanking the king. Then they have to move here, and then the pawn moves up with check, and the king moves back, moves up again with check. The king move here, queen check, mate. So back to the original position. The book example has us use the reserve move first, so we'll move the pawn to g4. Kings are still have opposition, but now it's black's move. Now say he goes to h7, f7, h7, doesn't matter. Now we can outflank with king f6 here. If he goes to h8, then we can go... Well, again, the computer gives g6 is winning, f7 is winning, and g5 is winning. So you can't really mess this up. But the book has him go to g6. And again, here we use another reserve move. Move the pawn up. No matter where he goes, say he goes here, we outflank again. And we just have a clear path for our pawn, supported by our king. And this is pretty much everything I've talked about today is, for the most part, relevant for all the pawns in B, C, D, E, F, and G files. But what about the rook files, the A file and the H file? This entire file and this entire file, the ones on the side of the board. It's most of the time, if the kings are duking it out, it's going to be a draw. Because the usual point here is you need to outflank. He goes to one side, you go to the other side. But if everything is on just one side, if he goes here, you go here, and he goes here. If you go here and he goes here, this will be a check, and he goes here, and that's a stalemate. So the specific book example goes here, king here, and a black pawn here. White to move. So here we have the opposition. Well, we lose the opposition, but it doesn't matter because the pawn's on the side of the board. So all we do is just move to h1, and if the pawn moves up, it's stalemate. If the black king moves here, the white king moves here, and the black king will lose the pawn. So if it's just a rook's pawn, if the defender's king can get in the way almost at all, if you let him in, it's a draw. But for pretty much any other's file, it's more complex than that, whether you can defend or not. This next example is titled Quantity is Not Quality, and it gives this outlandish example. I'm going to set it up. It's kind of funny, actually. It's like this. Black has 6 pawns, all on the H file, which in an actual game I'm not sure is actually possible. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay, it's theoretically possible. In theory. But this will never be obtained in a real game. But this concept still stands. The pawns are all in a line, they cannot help each other. So if the defending king stands in the pawn's path, not even six rook pawns are enough to win. So we just go king here. And if the black king goes here, it's a stalemate. If he goes anywhere else, we just start uh eating. Well, if he goes here, well, actually no, this is not stalemate because we can just eat all these pawns. Say if he goes here, we can just eat, and we're still uh say we're still in the way, but say their king goes to g4, we just go back to h1. And he comes forward here. Literally either legal move. Back here is good, as it's just a little bit of going back and forth, a little song and dance. So we go back. He comes back. If we go here, and he goes here, then we just go here. As that's stalemate. And if the king goes somewhere, then we come back up. Again, G1 and H1 are both good for white because we're on, these are rook pawns, and it doesn't matter if you lose opposition. The exact example in the book goes H1, F3, takes on H2, G4, H1, G3, King G1, H2 check, King H1, King G4, King takes, H3, King H1. This is just repeating the same thing over and over. King G3, King G1, H4, King H1, H5, King G1, H6, King H1. He just has to stay right here, and you're fine. You go King F3, but then you go to H2, G4, back to King H1. King G3, G1, H2 check, back in the corner. And the only way to avoid stalemate is just constantly giving up these pawns. So now there's another concept for the defender of that's called imprisoning the stronger side's king. And the example they give is like this. Black king here, white king on d2, and a black pawn on a5. White to move. So black can go to b2 on its turn, but it's our turn. And so the key squares here are c2 and c1. So we're going to take our king to c1. But say he tries to get opposition by going to king a2, which is the only way to prevent us from getting to a1 and just blocking the pawn. And now we can go to c2, and now the black king is kind of stuck on the a file here. He can't go here, here, or here. Let's say pawn goes here. We just need to keep opposition. If we go to c3, well, actually, it still says it's a draw. Because even if he goes here, actually, we just go here and take the pawn. If he goes here, same thing. So he has to go there. But he's kind of trapped. So we go back to c2. And if he goes to b4, we have opposition, like this. Then king goes to c1. If he goes to a3, we go back to c2. King a1, king c1, pawn a2. But now it's a stalemate, and it's the stronger side's king is stalemated. In order to draw against a rook's pawn, placing the king in front of the pawn is enough, but occupying one of the two nearest squares on the bishop file also works. In this example, it was c1 and c2. So these two squares.